The moment Letitia Yates pushed open the heavy oak door of the Caldwell Savings and Trust Bank on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, every man inside that building felt the particular stillness that precedes something significant, though not a single one of them could have explained why. She was not a beautiful woman in the way that stopped a room. She was not young, not soft, not draped in velvet or carrying a parasol. She was 34 years old, dressed in a faded navy dress that had been washed so many times the fabric had taken on a grayish undertone along the hem and cuffs. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face with a severity that suggested she had no patience for stray things, not stray hairs, and certainly not stray sympathies. Her back was as straight as a fence post set deep in good Kansas soil, and her hands, wrapped around a battered leather satchel, were red and cracked along the knuckles, the kind of hands that told a longer story than any woman would willingly speak aloud. She walked to the counter with the measured, purposeful stride of someone who had made this decision more than once, and had arrived here only after every other avenue had been exhausted. In the corner of the bank, away from the teller's windows and the polished brass fittings, a man sat waiting in one of the two wooden chairs positioned near the wall. He was not doing anything noteworthy. He had his hat resting on his knee and a folded piece of paper in his left hand that he had not unfolded since sitting down. He was James Lockhart, rancher, 41 years of age, with the kind of face that the Kansas sun had etched its entire autobiography across deep lines at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that had been shaved that morning but was already suggesting otherwise, and dark eyes that moved the way a man's eyes move when he has learned to read a landscape before he enters it. He had been watching the door in the idle, habitual way of a man who simply observes his surroundings. And then the door opened, and Letitia Yates walked in, and James Lockhart stopped observing idly and started watching with intention. He noticed the satchel. He noticed the way she squared her shoulders before approaching the counter, the tiny, involuntary lift of her chin. He noticed her hands. He had grown up watching his mother's hands do everything a ranch required, and he knew what cracked knuckles on a woman meant. It meant she had been doing the work of more than one person for longer than was fair. Hector Prout, the bank manager, was a round man with small spectacles and the particular brand of courteous dismissal that certain men in positions of minor authority had perfected in that era. He came out from behind the inner office door when he saw Letitia approaching, which was itself unusual, and James watched the man's face settle into an expression that was technically pleasant but fundamentally evasive. "Mrs. Yates," Prout said, "I had rather expected you might send a letter first." "I sent 3 letters, Mr. Prout," Letitia said, and her voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that had been steadied by considerable practice. "You answered none of them." "I was meaning to respond," Prout said. "These things take time, you understand. The bank has processes." "My property does not have time," she said. She set the satchel on the counter and unfastened the clasp with the careful, deliberate movements of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. "I have the deed. I have the payment records going back 8 years. I have my husband's ledgers, which show that the mortgage was current at the time of his death in November last. What I do not have is an explanation for why this bank sent a letter in February claiming the property is 3 months in arrears." Prout's pleasant expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "The matter is somewhat complicated, Mrs. Yates. There were certain administrative adjustments made after Mr. Yates' passing." "Administrative adjustments," she repeated, and the 2 words landed on the counter between them like stones dropped from a height. It was at this precise moment that James Lockhart stood up. He did not say anything. He simply rose from the wooden chair with the unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision and is now acting on it. He set his hat on his head and crossed the bank floor, and he positioned himself 2 steps behind and to the right of Letitia Yates, and he folded his arms and stood there. He did not introduce himself. He did not explain his presence. He simply stood, with his 6 feet of sun-weathered height and his 7 years of being the largest landowner in 3 counties, and he looked at Hector Prout with an expression of polite but absolute attentiveness. Prout's eyes flickered to James, registered what they saw, and flickered back to Letitia. The calculation that moved across his face was visible if you were watching for it. Letitia had not turned around. She had heard the footsteps, felt the presence settle in behind her, and for one wild moment she thought it might be trouble of a different kind. But there was something in the quality of the silence coming from whoever stood at her back, a steadiness, a settled weight that did not feel hostile. She did not turn. She kept her eyes on Prout. "I would like to see the specific document authorizing these alleged arrears," she said. "The original document, Mr. Prout, not a copy prepared for this conversation." Prout cleared his throat. "I will need to retrieve that from the files. If you would care to wait, we will wait here," James said. It was the first thing he had said, and Letitia did turn then quickly, because the voice had been calm and unambiguous and had included her in a "we" without asking permission, which she was not entirely sure how to receive. She looked up at him. He was looking at Prout. His profile was angular and deliberate and entirely focused on the bank manager, and he showed no sign of having noticed that she had turned to examine him. "Mr. Lockhart," Prout said carefully, with a somewhat different quality of courtesy than he had extended to Letitia. "I didn't see you there." "I know," James said simply. Prout went to find the document. Letitia turned back to the counter and was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking at James, she said, "I didn't ask for help." "No, ma'am," James said. "You didn't. I am perfectly capable of handling this matter myself." "Yes, ma'am," James said. "I can see that." Another silence. She shifted the papers on the counter, straightening them though they did not need straightening. "Why did you stand up?" she asked. He considered the question with a seriousness that surprised her when she finally glanced sideways at him. He was not a man who gave easy answers. She could see that already. He had the look of someone for whom words were tools rather than ornamentation, and he used them accordingly. "Because the way that man looked at you when you walked in told me he was planning to make things difficult for you," James said. "And I don't have anywhere else I need to be this morning." It was such a straightforward answer that she did not know what to do with it. She had been preparing for something condescending, some version of the helpless woman narrative that men in 1883 Kansas deployed with such comfortable frequency. This was not that. She looked at him fully then for the first time. He met her eyes with the same directness he had applied to everything else, and he did not smile in an ingratiating way or look away in an embarrassed way. He just looked at her with a frank, attentive steadiness that she found simultaneously disarming and somewhat irritating, because she had not come to the Caldwell Savings and Trust Bank to be disarmed. "Letitia Yates," she said, because it seemed the situation called for an introduction. "James Lockhart," he said. "I know who you are," she said, surprising herself. She had heard the name, of course. Anyone who had spent more than a season in Caldwell County, Kansas, had heard of James Lockhart and the Lockhart Ranch, which spread across 4,000 acres of good grassland south of the Cimarron River. She had heard he was fair, that he paid decent wages to his hands and had been a friend to the small farmers when the cattle drives were trampling spring crops. She had also heard he had a temper with dishonest men, which now seemed relevant. "I've heard your name too," James said. "Yates Creek draws its name from your husband's property." "My property," she said, "which is why I am here." Prout returned with a folder of papers that had the slightly too organized quality of documents assembled in a hurry to look credible. Letitia went through them with a methodical, line-by-line thoroughness that made Prout visibly uncomfortable. James watched and said nothing. His presence was doing its work without requiring him to speak. When she found the discrepancy, a backdated notation on a payment receipt that had been altered, the original ink of the date showing faintly through what had been written over it, she set her finger on the spot and looked up at Prout without any expression at all. "This date has been changed," she said. I cannot imagine how Prout began. "Mr. Prout," James said quietly, "you have known me for 11 years. I would like you to consider very carefully what you say next." The bank manager looked at the paper. He looked at James. He looked at Letitia, who had not moved her finger from the spot. "There may have been an error," Prout said, "in processing." "An error," Letitia said. "Yes, I imagine there was." By the end of that morning, Hector Prout had produced a corrected accounting that showed the Yates property was not only current on its mortgage payments, but had in fact been overpaying slightly for the previous 2 quarters, and he had provided a written acknowledgement of the same on bank letterhead. Letitia folded the papers into her satchel with the same measured deliberateness with which she had unpacked them, and she walked out of the Caldwell Savings and Trust Bank with her back as straight as it had been when she walked in. James walked out behind her and stopped on the boardwalk, replacing his hat against the April sun. She turned to face him on the wooden planks outside the bank door, and for a moment they stood in the particular clarity of late spring light, the dust of Caldwell's Main Street drifting past them, the sounds of a working town moving around them like water around stones. "Thank you," she said, and the words were precise and unornamental, which he appreciated. "You had already won it before I stood up," he said. "You knew exactly what you were looking for." "Yes," she said, "but he would have told me to come back next week and the week after that. You made it happen today." She studied him for a moment with those level dark eyes. "I don't know why you did that for a stranger." "You weren't entirely a stranger," James said. "I knew Eli Yates." Something shifted in her face at her husband's name, not grief exactly, because it had been 17 months since Eli died and she had done her grieving in the private dark of a farmhouse where there was no one to witness it. It was more like recognition, the way a scar recognizes pressure. "He was a good man," she said. "One of the best I knew," James agreed. "He helped me once when I needed it and didn't make a production of it. I thought of him when I saw what was happening in there." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she nodded, a single brief motion. "Good day, Mr. Lockhart," she said. "Good day, Mrs. Yates," he said. She walked to her wagon, which was tied further down the street, loaded with the supplies she had come to town to collect after the bank business. He watched her climb up onto the seat with the competent, practiced ease of a woman who did not require assistance with the ordinary operations of her life, and he watched the wagon pull away down the main street of Caldwell toward the South Road, and he stood on that boardwalk for a few moments longer than was strictly necessary before heading to his own horse. He thought about Eli Yates on the ride home, and about Eli's wife with her cracked hands and her straight back, and about the altered document in the bank file, and his jaw tightened in the way that it did when he encountered dishonesty being applied to people who deserved better. The Lockhart Ranch was called the Double L, established by James's father in 1861, and James had taken it over at age 19 when his father died of a fever that moved too fast for the doctor from Dodge City to arrive in time. He had spent the better part of his adult life building it into something substantial, and the effort had cost him certain things that he did not often examine in direct light. He had been engaged once to a woman named Clara Bishop, but Clara had married a banker from Wichita in 1875, and James had eventually decided that this was probably the sensible outcome for everyone concerned, including himself. He was not a man who spent much time in loneliness, because he was not a man with much available time at all. The ranch demanded everything in every season, and his hands were good men, but they needed direction, and direction required presence. He was at ease with his life in the way that a well-built structure is at ease with itself, not comfortable exactly, but sound. And yet that evening, eating supper alone in the kitchen of the ranch house that his father had built and he had extended twice, he found himself thinking about a woman he had spoken perhaps a dozen sentences to, and specifically about the way she had set her finger on that altered date with the precision of someone who had anticipated the deception and prepared for it. He thought, she had done all the work herself. She had gathered the documents, identified the discrepancy, prepared her argument. She had walked into that bank alone and stood her ground alone, and she would have won it alone, only it would have taken longer and cost her more in the wearing down way that institutional delays cost people who cannot afford delays. He thought Eli Yates would have been glad someone stood up. He poured himself another cup of coffee and told himself to stop thinking about it. He was not particularly successful. 3 weeks passed, and James Lockhart found reasons to be in town more than his usual schedule required. He told himself this was because the spring cattle count needed finalizing and the feed store shipment needed confirming, which were both true. He did not examine what else it might be. He did not see Letitia Yates on any of those visits, which he also told himself he had not been expecting. It was Tom Haverfield, his foreman, who mentioned her first, in the entirely incidental way that a foreman mentions things that do not seem important. "You hear about the Yates widow," Tom said one morning over the breakfast table in the bunkhouse, addressing the assembled hands as much as James. "Word is she's been running that property alone since November before last. No hands, no family nearby, just her and those 2 boys. How old are the boys?" James asked, and he asked it in the neutral, informational tone of a man acquiring general knowledge about a neighbor. Tom thought. 7 and 9, I think, something like that. Young enough that they help but don't do the heavy work yet. James applied himself to his breakfast and did not say anything else, but he thought about it. He thought about 320 acres of creek-bottom farmland on the southern stretch of the county, and a woman alone with 2 young boys, doing the work that required at minimum 2 adult men to do it properly. He thought about cracked hands and what they meant. The following Saturday he was in town again, and this time he saw her. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a sack of flour on her shoulder, and a boy on either side of her, one carrying a wrapped parcel, and one tugging at her sleeve with whatever urgency young boys generate over inconsequential matters. She had shifted the flour to her other shoulder to free her right hand, which she placed briefly on the tugging boy's head in a gesture of acknowledgement that was somehow both absent-minded and fully present. James tied his horse and crossed the street. "Mrs. Yates," he said, and both boys looked up at him with the frank, unguarded curiosity of children who have not yet learned to pretend they are not looking. She turned, and the slight tension that came into her face when she recognized him was interesting to him. It was not unwelcoming exactly. It was the look of a woman who had been managing her own perimeter and was uncertain how to process an arrival. "Mr. Lockhart," she said, "can I take that?" He nodded at the flour sack. She hesitated, and in the hesitation he could see the argument she was having with herself, which he recognized because he had the same kind of argument with himself about certain things. "The wagon is just down there," she said, which was not yes but was not no either. He lifted the flour sack from her shoulder with ease and she let him, and the 2 boys fell into step alongside them with the sociable naturalness of children. "That's Eli Jr.," she said, "and that's Samuel. Boys, this is Mr. Lockhart. He has the ranch south of the river." "The big one," said Samuel, who was the younger and evidently the less restrained of the 2. "Samuel," his mother said. "It is a fairly large operation," James agreed, looking down at the boy with an expression that was not quite a smile but was close to it. They reached the wagon and James settled the flour into the bed alongside the other supplies she had already loaded. He looked at the arrangement of supplies, the seed packets and the preserving jars and the new leather for repairing harness, and the picture they painted was of a woman managing every detail of a working farm with care and precision and no excess expenditure. "How are the spring plantings looking?" he asked, because it was a legitimate question between neighbors in April, and he wanted to keep talking to her for another 2 minutes. She looked at him with a brief, assessing quality, as if she was deciding whether the question was genuine or conversational filler. "The creek field is good," she said. "The north slope is slower than I'd like. I could use another pair of hands for the harrowing, but I've managed with what I have." "I have men finishing up the early calving run," James said. "After that, there are some hours available before the branding season starts in earnest. If you need it, "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Lockhart," she said, and the words were not sharp but they were clear. "It wouldn't be charity," he said. "Your husband helped me with a fence line dispute in 1880. He spent 4 days riding out with me to document the boundary markers when my neighbor was claiming an extra quarter section. I never had the chance to repay that properly." He looked at her steadily. "This would be repaying a debt." She was quiet for a moment. The boys had climbed into the wagon bed and were engaged in whatever private enterprises occupied boys of 7 and 9 when given a moment of inattention. "He never mentioned that," she said. "He wouldn't have," James said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the wagon, and then she looked at the 2 boys in the back of it, and she made the particular kind of calculation that a woman alone makes when she has pride on one side and practical necessity on the other. "The harrowing would take 2 days with proper help," she said. "I've been stretching it to 4 alone." "I can send 2 men next Thursday," James said. "Good workers, not the kind who need supervising every minute. I'll provide the noon meal," she said. "That's the arrangement. They work, I feed them." "That's a fair arrangement," James agreed. She nodded and climbed up onto the wagon seat and collected the reins with those red, capable hands. "Good day, Mr. Lockhart," she said. "Good day, Mrs. Yates." He watched the wagon go, and this time he was watching it long enough that old Jim Petty's, who ran the barber shop across the street, called out from his doorway with a laugh in his voice. "Fine spring morning to stand in the middle of the street, James." "Yes, it is," James said, and went to get his horse. He sent 2 men on Thursday, his best men, Pete Adler and Henry Gallows, both of whom had been with him 8 years and could work hard and behave themselves. He did not go himself. He told himself this was because he had the cattle count to finish and because it was not appropriate, and both of these things were true. But on Friday afternoon, when Pete and Henry returned and reported over supper that the North Slope had been harrowed clean, and Mrs. Yates had served the best noon meal either of them had eaten outside the bunkhouse in memory, James asked more questions than the situation strictly required. "She works hard," Pete said, with the respectful simplicity of a man who recognized his own professional standards being met. "Out there with them 2 boys from sunup. Knows her land too. Showed me where the soil drainage runs and why she angles the rows the way she does. Smart about it. Good farm," Henry added. "Some deferred maintenance on the outbuildings, but the main house and the barn are solid. She's kept up the essentials." James absorbed this information over his coffee and said nothing more about it. He went himself the following week. On a pretext he fabricated concerning a fence line that ran along the edge of the Yates property on its eastern boundary. It was a thin pretext, and he knew it was a thin pretext. The fence line was perfectly clear and had never been in dispute. He wrote it anyway. He was mending a sag in the wire on the far eastern edge when he heard hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the farmhouse, and looked up to see Letitia Yates coming across the field on a sturdy bay mare, with young Eli Jr. riding behind her on the same horse. She pulled up 10 yards away and studied him with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and suspicion. "Is there actually a problem with that fence?" she asked. He considered lying and decided against it, because she struck him as someone who would know. "The wire was a little loose," he said. "I saw it loose last month," she said. "I was planning to fix it next week." "I had wire," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was the indication that a smile existed somewhere in the vicinity. "Would you like to come up to the house?" she said. "I have coffee on." "I would," he said. "Thank you." He tied his horse to the post by the door of the farmhouse and followed her inside. And the house struck him immediately as a place that had been made into a home by considerable effort and intention. It was clean and ordered in the serious way of a woman who understood that disorder in a home spreads outward into disorder everywhere. There were curtains at the windows, plain white ones, recently washed. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace, an actual shelf of books, which was not a common sight in farmhouses in Caldwell County, Kansas, in 1883. There was a braided rug on the floor and a rocking chair by the window that had a small pile of mending beside it that she swept into a basket with a single practiced motion before he could look at it too closely. Young Eli Jr. had disappeared in the direction of the back of the house, where James could hear the younger boy's voice. Letitia poured coffee into 2 plain white cups and set one on the table in front of him, and then she sat across the table and wrapped both hands around her own cup. "You knew Eli," she said. "For how long?" "Since 1876, James said. "He moved onto this land in late spring of that year. I rode over to introduce myself in June. He was building the south fence, and I helped him finish it, and he fed me supper afterward, and that was the start of it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a chicken protested something loudly, and a boy's voice shushed it. "He talked about you," she said. "He said you were the most decent large landowner in the county. He said most men who had what you have became something else with it, but you stayed yourself." James looked down at his coffee cup. "That's generous." "He wasn't a generous man with praise," she said, and the love in her voice for her dead husband was plain and honest and not deployed for effect. "He meant it. He meant most things he said. That was Eli." "Yes," James said. "It was." They were quiet for a moment together, and the quiet was easy in the particular way of people who are not performing their ease. "How are you managing?" James asked. "Truly." She looked at him, and he watched her decide whether to give him the polished answer or the real one. "I'm managing," she said. "The farm is viable. The boys are good. The bank issue is resolved, thanks in part to your presence last month." She turned her coffee cup between her hands. "The hardest part is not the work. The work I know how to do. The hardest part is making decisions without anyone to think them through with. Eli and I used to sit right here at this table every evening and talk through what needed doing and why. Now I talk it through in my head, and sometimes I'm not sure I'm asking myself the right questions." "What are you deciding right now?" James asked. She looked at him with a slight start, as if she had not expected the question to be so direct. "Whether to plant the east field with winter wheat or keep it in corn," she said. "The corn did well last year, but the wheat prices have been stronger. I've been going back and forth on it." "What does the soil tell you?" he asked. She blinked. "The soil, the texture of it, the drainage, which does it prefer?" She was quiet for a moment, and then something shifted in her expression into something more alive, more engaged. "It prefers the corn, actually. The drainage is better for corn." "But the market will not always be what it is today," James said. "But the soil will always be what it is. Plant what the land is asking for. You can work the market on properties where you have flexibility. Work with what's certain where you don't." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, and then she said, "That is exactly what Eli would have said." "Good advice is good advice," James said, and he said it lightly because the look on her face was making him careful. He stayed for another hour, and they talked about the farm and about the county and about the town, and she was sharp and opinionated, and had the kind of mind that moved between the practical and the philosophical with a naturalness he found unexpectedly invigorating. She had strong views on the treatment of the Osage people whose lands had been absorbed by the expanding territory, and she spoke about it with a directness that was unusual and welcome. "My husband worked alongside Osage men during his first years in Kansas," she said. "He said their knowledge of the land made everything that came after possible, and that the country had repaid that knowledge with treaties broken one after another. It disgusted him. It disgusts me." "He was right," James said. "The land grants and the cattle empires, they were all built on top of something that was taken. I don't think we can forget that, even as we try to build something decent in what's here now." She looked at him with that direct, assessing look. "Most men in your position don't think about it." "Most men in my position inherited the habit of not thinking about it," James said. "My mother was different. She made me think about it." "Your mother sounds like someone I would have liked." "She would have liked you," he said, and then they were both quiet for a moment because the warmth in the statement had arrived somewhat faster than either of them had anticipated. He rode home that evening through the long gold light of a Kansas spring afternoon, and he did not tell himself to stop thinking about anything, because clearly that was not working. He came back the following Saturday, this time without pretense. He came with a length of timber he said was left over from a repair job, which it was, and he fixed the sagging door of the smokehouse that Letitia had mentioned in passing. She brought him water and stood in the yard watching him work with her arms folded and her expression neutral, and when he was done she said, "You didn't have to do that." "It was bothering me," he said. "You've seen it once." "Some things you only need to see once to know they're going to bother you," he said, and he was not entirely sure he was only talking about the door. She fed him dinner that day, the three of them at the table, which is to say her and James and both boys, because Samuel had appointed himself James's companion with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who had decided a new person was interesting, and young Eli Jr. watched James with the more complicated attention of a boy who is simultaneously intrigued and protective. "Do you have any children?" young Eli asked at the table. "No," James said. "Why not?" "Eli," his mother said. "It's all right," James said. He thought about it with the genuine considerateness of a man who believes a child's question deserves a real answer. "I was building my ranch for a long time," he said, "and I suppose I didn't make the time for it that I should have." "Did you want some?" Samuel asked. "Samuel," Letitia said, more firmly this time. "I wouldn't have minded," James said simply, and he caught Letitia's eye across the table and she looked away first. The visits continued. They were never planned in any formal way. There was always a reason, a piece of equipment to borrow or return, a question about the shared fence line, a spare hand during a difficult week. But the reasons became more obviously pretextual as the weeks passed, and neither of them mentioned this directly, though both of them were aware of it. It was the end of June before anything changed between them, and the change was precipitated not by either of them but by Samuel, who fell out of the hayloft and landed wrong on his left arm and screamed with the pure, immediate shock of a child in real pain. James was there that afternoon, legitimately there, helping reinforce the barn rafters before the summer storms arrived, and he was the one who caught the boy on the second bounce, essentially, having moved without thought when the scream began. He held Samuel and talked to him in the low, even voice of a man who knew how to calm panicked horses and applied the same principle now, and Letitia arrived at a dead run from the kitchen garden to find her younger son held against James Lockhart's chest, still crying but visibly steadying. The arm was broken. James drove them to town in the Yates wagon because his was faster, and because Letitia was in the back with Samuel and someone needed to handle the reins. Dr. Ambrose set the arm with the competent efficiency of a frontier doctor who had seen this particular injury perhaps 200 times, and Samuel bore it with the suffering dignity of a 7-year-old who was being very brave and knew it, and then cried hard after it was done when the braveness ran out. Letitia held her boy in the doctor's office and pressed her face briefly against his hair, and James stood at the window of the office looking out at the street, giving her that moment without audience. On the drive back, with Samuel asleep in the wagon bed and young Eli Jr. sitting beside his brother with a watchful protectiveness that made James think of the man the boy was going to be, Letitia sat beside James on the wagon seat and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there." "You would have managed," he said. "You always manage." "Managing alone," she said, "is different from not being alone." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the darkening road, and her profile was calm and deliberate in the way of someone who has said a thing carefully and is now waiting to see what it costs them. "Yes," he said. "It is." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. It had more weight to it, more awareness. The evening was warm and the stars were beginning to appear, and the horses moved at a steady walk through the blue Kansas twilight, and James Lockhart was sitting closer to Letitia Yates on that wagon seat than he had been when they set out from town. He was not sure when that had happened. He suspected she was not entirely sure either. Neither of them moved apart. He helped settle the boys when they got back, carried Samuel into his bed, because the boy was deeply asleep, and the broken arm needed to be supported. And Letitia tucked him in with the focused tenderness of a mother whose children are the central gravitational force of her existence. And then she walked James to the door. They stood in the doorway in the warm night, with the sound of crickets rising around the farmhouse and a mockingbird somewhere in the cottonwoods starting its evening performance. "He asked if I wanted children," James said unexpectedly. He meant Samuel's question at the dinner table weeks ago, and she would know what he meant. "He is direct," she said. "I've been thinking about it since," James said. "What I answered." She looked at him, and the moonlight was enough to see by. "I was honest," he said. "I wouldn't have minded." He met her eyes. "I'm 41 years old. I have a good ranch and good men and a house that is more rooms than one person needs. I have not been unhappy, Letitia." He said her name for the first time without the formal address preceding it, and she was still. "But I am aware of what is missing." "James," she said, and her use of his name in return was quiet and measured, and told him nothing definitive, which told him something. "I am not asking you for anything tonight," he said. "I am only being honest about where I am, because you deserve honesty and I don't have any other gear." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My hands are cracked and my hair has gone gray at the temples, and I have 2 boys who are a great deal of work and the best thing in my life simultaneously." "I know," he said. "I was married for 12 years," she said. "I loved my husband very much. He is gone, and that is a fact I live with every single day, and I will live with it always. That doesn't end." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to put it down." She looked at him for a long time, and he waited, because she was worth waiting for, and he knew it, and it did not cost him anything to be patient. "I need to think," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said, and he meant it. He rode home through the full dark of a June night with the stars blazing overhead the way they did in Kansas when you got far enough from town, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time, not certainty, exactly, but the possibility of certainty, which was its own kind of warmth. She did not come to him. He did not expect her to. But after 2 weeks she sent a note with young Eli Jr., who arrived at the Double L Ranch gate on a borrowed pony with the self-important bearing of a boy entrusted with a mission, and handed James a folded piece of paper. The note said, "The boys ask about you. I find myself without good answers to give them. Come for supper on Friday if you are willing. Ly." He smiled at the note in the way he had not smiled in some time, and he told Eli Jr. to tell his mother he would be there. And the boy rode off on his borrowed pony with the same self-important bearing. And Tom Haverfield, who had witnessed this transaction from the bunkhouse doorway, made a remark about the nice weather they had been having lately, which James ignored with dignity. He came for supper on Friday, and the next Friday, and the Friday after that, and somewhere in those Friday evenings, over Letitia's good cooking and the boys' animated conversations about farm animals and school lessons, and the relative merits of different kinds of pie, something settled between him and Letitia Yates that was different from what had been settling before. It was August when he first held her hand. They were standing at the edge of the east field at the end of a long day in which they had worked alongside each other rehanging the barn doors, and the light was gold and long, and the corn was tall and dark green, and moving softly in the evening air, and he reached over and took her hand without planning to, the same way he had stood up in the bank without words, without preamble, simply because it was the right thing to do in that moment. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment, his worn and brown from years of ranch work, hers red and rough from years of farm work, the 2 kinds of working hands looking entirely correct together, and then she looked up at him. "I have thought," she said, and he asked, "and I think," she said carefully, "that Eli would have wanted this, Not because he was gone and I needed managing, he would never have thought that way, but because he knew what you were and he would have said a woman who has your back and your honesty and your willingness to stand up without being asked is a good thing. That is what I think. What do you want? James asked. Not what Eli would have wanted. What do you want? She looked at the corn for a moment and then at him, and there was something in her face that had not been there in the beginning, an openness, a willingness to be seen. I want not to do it alone, she said. I want to sit across the table from someone I respect and think things through. I want my boys to have someone. She paused. I want to see if this is what I think it is. Between us. So do I, he said. He did not kiss her then. He was not the kind of man who moved faster than the situation called for, and the situation called for the continued holding of hands in a cornfield at sunset, which was itself an entirely sufficient development for one evening. But he walked back to the house with her and he stayed for supper, and when the boys were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, he sat across the table from her in the lamplight and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. And when he finally rode home in the late summer dark, he was not thinking about cattle counts or fence lines or any of the ordinary machinery of his life. He was thinking that 41 years old was not too late. The fall of 1883 was the fall in which Caldwell County learned, through the reliable medium of observation and subsequent conversation, that the Lockhart rancher had been spending considerable time at the Yates widow's farm. Opinions on this matter varied. The women of the First Methodist Church were broadly supportive, several of them having privately felt for some time that James Lockhart had been a good man going to waste without a family to direct his considerable capacities. The men at the Longhorn Saloon were more varied in their views, with the understanding that most of their views on the situation were substantially less informed than they imagined. Hector Prout, when the subject arose at a merchants' meeting, said nothing, because he had the good sense to recognize that James Lockhart's affection for a woman Prout had tried to swindle was not a situation in which commentary served his interests. Letitia herself was aware of the town's attention and addressed it with the same directness she applied to everything else. She neither concealed James's visits nor performed them, and when Mabel Harper from the Mercantile asked, with her particular blend of warmth and acquisitiveness, whether there was something developing between her and Mr. Lockhart, Letitia said, "We are keeping company, Mrs. Harper, and I will thank you not to put more decoration on it than that at present," which Mabel Harper duly reported to everyone she encountered for the next 2 weeks as confirmation that they were practically engaged. James proposed in October. He did not plan it as a grand gesture, partly because he was not constitutionally suited to grand gestures, and partly because he knew Letitia well enough by then to understand that a grand gesture was not what she wanted. What she wanted was honesty and directness, and that was what he gave her. They were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse in the October evening, the boys inside doing their schoolwork by lamplight, the harvest done and the fields quiet, and the sky the deep cold blue of autumn in Kansas, with the first stars appearing and the smell of the wood smoke from the kitchen. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to marry you and I want to help raise your boys and I want to work this land alongside you and mine alongside each other. I want to make a life that is better than either of us has been making alone, and I believe we could do that. I believe it with a certainty I have not applied to much in my personal life." She was quiet for a moment. "What would that mean for this farm?" she asked. "For my land." "Your land stays your land," he said immediately. "I want no claim on it. We can draw up papers to that effect if you want, that the Yates property belongs to you and to your boys in perpetuity. I don't need your land, Letitia. I need you." She looked at the dark field for a moment, and then she looked at her hands, and then she looked at him. "Yes," she said. He took her hands, both of them, those cracked and capable hands, and held them in his, and they sat like that on the porch in the October dark, and it was not romantic in the showy sense, but it was romantic in the truest sense, which is the sense of two people who have found in each other something they had not known they were still looking for. Inside, Samuel appeared at the window, evidently having found a reason to pause in his schoolwork. "Are you holding hands?" Samuel shouted through the glass. "Mind your arithmetic," Letitia called back, but James could feel her smiling. They were married in December in the Caldwell First Methodist Church, with the Reverend Gaines presiding and most of the county in attendance, because a social event of this caliber in Caldwell County in December of 1883 was not something that could be attended to sparsely. The church was decorated with evergreen boughs and dried wildflowers, and Letitia wore a dress that her friend Martha Connell had helped her make, a deep green wool that was neither bridal white nor widow's black, a color that was entirely and deliberately itself. She walked in alone, as she had walked into the bank, with her back straight and her hands quiet, and she walked down the aisle with both her boys flanking her, Samuel gripping her hand with fierce concentration and young Eli Jr. walking with a serious, protective dignity that made several women in the pews weep quietly. James stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and the expression on his face was one that Tom Haverfield would describe later that evening to his wife as the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck, and also cannot believe he almost missed it. The vows, they said, were the traditional ones, and they said them with the plain, unflinching directness with which they said everything to each other. And when the Reverend Gaines pronounced them, married, the church erupted in the enthusiastic approval of a community that had been quietly rooting for this outcome since approximately April. James kissed his bride with proper brevity, and she looked up at him with her level dark eyes and said, very quietly, "Well then," which was, he decided, the most perfect possible thing she could have said. The wedding supper was held at the Caldwell Meeting Hall, and involved more food than was strictly architectural, and dancing that went on until well past midnight, and James danced with both his stepsons, which Samuel found hilarious and young Eli Jr. found unexpectedly agreeable, and he danced 3 times with his wife, while various citizens of Caldwell County watched with the satisfied warmth of people witnessing something that had always been going to happen if the universe was running properly. On the first night of their marriage, in the farmhouse on the Yates property, where they had decided to spend the first winter before discussing which property would be their primary residence, James Lockhart sat on the edge of the bed in the room that had been Letitia's alone since November of 1881, and looked around at the room, the books, the plain curtains, the braided rug, the small wooden cross above the window, and understood that he was being trusted with something of great value. Letitia came in from seeing the boys to bed and sat beside him, and they were quiet together in the way they had become good at being quiet together. "Scared?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "You?" "Some," he admitted. "Good," she said. "I wouldn't trust anyone who wasn't." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and outside the December wind moved over the Kansas grasslands with its full authority, and inside the farmhouse there was warmth and quiet and the sound of 2 boys sleeping down the hall, and James Lockhart thought that if this was how 41 years old ended, he had no complaints to file with anyone. The winter of 1883 going into 1884 was a hard one, as Kansas winters were, with blizzards that locked them in for days at a time, and temperatures that demanded constant vigilance with the livestock. But they worked it together, and the difference between working it together and working it alone was so profound that Letitia, shoveling frozen ice from the water trough one January morning with James working on the other side of it, stopped and looked across at him and said, "I didn't know how tired I was until I wasn't doing it alone." He looked up at her. Ice crystals were in her hair, and her face was red from the cold, and she was possibly the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. "You won't have to be tired that way again," he said. She threw a shovelful of ice at him. He had not seen that coming, and she laughed, a real, full laugh, the kind that reorganized her face entirely, and he had not heard her laugh like that before, and he decided at that moment that hearing her laugh like that as frequently as possible was going to be one of the central projects of his life going forward. He threw a shovelful of ice back, and the livestock watched this development with appropriate bovine detachment. Spring came with its annual announcement of itself across the Kansas landscape, and James and Letitia worked both properties that first season with a coordinated efficiency that impressed even Tom Haverfield, who was not easily impressed. The question of which property would be the primary residence was decided by practical factors. The Yates farmhouse was newer and better situated relative to the fields, but the Double L Ranch had the larger house and the better bunkhouse and the equipment. And so they negotiated it across several evenings and arrived at a solution that was, like most of their solutions, both pragmatic and equitable. They would move the household to the Double L Ranch house, which would be extended to accommodate a family properly, while maintaining the Yates farm as a working property managed by two of James's men on a profit-sharing arrangement that gave Letitia a direct financial stake and full ownership of the land remaining with her as per their agreement. The boys would grow up at the ranch, which offered them more to do and more to learn, and in the summers they would spend time at the farm that was their father's legacy. Young Eli Jr., who had become somewhat more relaxed with James over the winter, a process that had involved several serious conversations between them about his father, about respect, about what it meant for James to be in his life without replacing what had been before, was particularly enthusiastic about the ranch, and attached himself to Tom Haverfield with the determination of a boy who had decided to learn everything about horses. Samuel simply decided that James was wonderful and proceeded on that basis from approximately the third week of the marriage, with the unself-conscious directness of a child who had made a decision and saw no reason to be complicated about it. The extension of the ranch house was completed by late summer, and in the fall of 1884 Letitia Yates, Lockhart looked around the expanded kitchen of the Double L Ranch house with the expression of a woman who was quietly satisfied with the architecture of her life, both literal and otherwise. She was learning things about James. She was learning that he woke before dawn every day and made his own coffee before anyone else was up, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dark ranch yard in the particular stillness of a man who needs a few minutes alone before the world begins. She learned to come in quietly during those mornings and simply sit across from him with her own coffee, and they would watch the light come up over the eastern range together without speaking, and this had become one of her favorite things. She was learning that he had strong opinions about proper fence maintenance and very mild opinions about most social conventions, and that his temper, which was real and occasionally visible, was always directed at injustice rather than at people he could not control, which she considered an important distinction. She was learning that he was patient with children in the deeply practical way of a man who respected their personhood, and that young Eli Jr. had begun, without any fanfare, to show James the kinds of things he only showed people he trusted. She was learning that he looked at her as though she was entirely worth looking at, and that he had been doing this from the beginning and showed no signs of stopping, and that this was something she had not known she needed until she had it. She was learning that she loved him. This was not a surprise by the time she acknowledged it to herself, sitting at the kitchen table one evening in October watching him help Samuel with a drawing of a horse that kept going catastrophically wrong, with James's big sun-browned hand guiding the boy's smaller one and both of them completely absorbed in the project. She watched them and felt the knowledge of it settle in her chest like something that had found its right place. She told him on a Saturday evening after the boys were in bed, standing in the kitchen putting away the clean dishes, because that was the kind of woman she was. She would say the important things in the middle of the ordinary operations of a day, without ceremony, with full intention. "I love you," she said, handing him a pot to reach the high shelf with. He took the pot and placed it on the shelf and turned to look at her with those dark eyes that had always looked at her so directly. "I know," he said. "I have known for a while." "And you didn't say anything?" she asked with the first hint of exasperation. "I was waiting for you to get there," he said. "You don't like to be rushed." "I do not," she agreed, and then after a moment, "I love you." "I love you," he said, and said it like he had been wanting to say it for some time and was glad to finally have the occasion, which she could hear in his voice. She put the last dish away and turned around, and he was right there, closer than she had known, and he kissed her the way he had been learning to kiss her, not briefly, not hastily, but with the full, unhurried attention of a man who was in no rush to be anywhere else in the world. In the spring of 1885, Letitia discovered she was expecting a child. She told James at the kitchen table on an April morning, plainly and directly, as she told him most things. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she was briefly afraid of what the look meant, and then his face did something she had not seen it do before. It opened. Every line of it, every careful, controlled expression he habitually maintained, simply opened, and what was underneath was something luminous and undone and thoroughly un-rancher-like. "Letitia," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something he was protecting. "Don't you dare cry," she said, even though she was aware that she might cry, which was infuriating. "I am not going to cry," he said, and then he was in front of her and she was standing, and he held her with a care that she found both entirely necessary and entirely sufficient. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am 36 years old and I have had 2 children and I know what I am doing. Stop fussing." "I am going to fuss," he said. "That is my position on the matter." "You can fuss quietly," she said. "Agreed," he said. She was right that she knew what she was doing. She was also right that she was very well. The pregnancy progressed with the uncomplicated pragmatism of a healthy woman's second successful experience, and Letitia went about the business of the ranch and the farm with only such modifications to her routine as were absolutely medically necessary, which James monitored with an attentiveness that she occasionally found amusing and occasionally found sweet and occasionally found both simultaneously. He built a cradle. He built it himself in the evenings in the barn, working by lantern light, and it was evident that he had never built a cradle before but was approaching the project with the rigorous determination he applied to every physical challenge. It was not a beautiful cradle. It was a solid, well-made, absolutely structurally sound cradle with a slight asymmetry in one of the side panels that Letitia decided she would never mention. "It rocks smoothly," she said, testing it. "That was the main requirement," he said, with the satisfaction of a man who has successfully engineered a necessary object. She looked at him standing in the lamplight of the barn with sawdust on his shirt and the look on his face of a man who had made something for his child, and she felt the love for him so sharply it was almost like something else. "James," she said. "Yes." "Come here," she said. He came, and she kissed him in the barn by the lantern light with the cradle rocking gently behind her, and somewhere in the bunkhouse Tom Haverfield was explaining to new hands that the boss had become somewhat more human since getting married, which Haverfield said approvingly. In November of 1885, Letitia Lockhart gave birth to a boy. He arrived in the early hours of a Thursday morning with the assistance of Dr. Ambrose and a fierce November wind that rattled the windows and seemed to James, who was entirely useless and knew it, to be making a theatrical point. The boy was healthy and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's straight-set jaw, and a pair of lungs that immediately demonstrated their full operational capacity. James held him for the first time standing by the bedroom window, with the winter light coming in thin and silver, and the baby wrapped in the blanket Letitia had made over the preceding months, and the expression on James Lockhart's face was something that young Eli Jr. would remember for the rest of his life. He had come to the door of the room to peer in, and he saw his stepfather standing at the window holding a baby with a face that looked like all of a man's defenses had simply come down. And young Eli Jr. understood something in that moment about what it meant to love something new without it taking anything away from what had been before. They named the boy Robert Eli Lockhart. The middle name was not asked for or suggested. James offered it, and Letitia received it the way she received most things from James, with a direct look that carried more warmth than most speeches. Robert Eli Lockhart grew into his place in the household with the robust confidence of a child who has never known anything other than being surrounded by people who were glad he existed. By the time he was walking, he had established a particular relationship with his older brother Samuel, who had adopted the role of entertainer and co-conspirator, and young Eli Jr., who was 12 by then, and regarded the baby with a protective gravity that mirrored, though he did not know this, his mother's manner. The Double L Ranch continued to grow in those years. James expanded the cattle operation gradually and carefully, never beyond what the land could support, and with the help of Pete Adler and Henry Gallows, and a rotation of hands who stayed because the wages were good and the treatment was fair, it became one of the most productive operations in the region. The Yates farm continued under the profit-sharing arrangement and produced well, and Letitia kept the books for both properties with the same meticulous precision that she had brought to the bank confrontation in 1883. She had not become less formidable with marriage and children. She had become, if anything, more herself. There was a quality to her in those years, a settled, warm, rigorous aliveness that everyone around her could feel. She continued to hold opinions and express them. She started corresponding with other women in the territory who were facing similar legal and financial challenges as widows and women on their own, sharing information about property law and bank practices, and the resources available to those who knew where to look. James watched this correspondence with the uncomplicated admiration of a man who had known she was intelligent from the first day, and was not surprised, but was continuously pleased by what that intelligence produced. Hector Prout left the Caldwell Savings and Trust in early 1886, under circumstances that were described as voluntary retirement, but which several people in town, including James Lockhart, understood more precisely. The bank's new manager, a younger man named Theodore Wiley, came with references from Wichita and within his first month had introduced himself to the Lockharts and made it plain that the bank considered their custom valuable and their account in good standing. This was a development that gave Letitia a satisfaction she did not need to express aloud. It was in the summer of 1886, 3 years into the marriage, that the two of them had their first serious disagreement. It was about land specifically, about a parcel of land adjacent to the Double L's northern boundary that became available when its owner, an aging homesteader named Clive Marsh, decided to sell and return to Missouri. James wanted to buy it. Letitia thought the price was too high and the timing was wrong, and that they were in a better position to wait 6 months and see if the price adjusted. The argument was conducted at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, with the maps spread out between them and the books open, and it was conducted with full force by both of them. James had never had anyone push back at him on a business decision with Letitia's quality of organized, evidenced counterargument, and he found it simultaneously frustrating and entirely engaging. On the second evening, after they had argued in circles for approximately an hour, he sat back and looked at her across the maps. "You're probably right about the timing," he said. "I am," she said, without excessive ceremony. "But you're right that if we wait too long someone else buys it and we lose the northern boundary access. So we negotiate down. She agreed. "And if Marsh won't move below 1700, then we let him take his 1700 to Missouri and we look at the Pearson parcel instead. The Pearson parcel doesn't have the same creek access," he said. "No," she said, "but it has the better grazing." They looked at each other across the maps. "I like arguing with you," he said. "I know," she said. "You like it because I argue with facts, not volume. Also because you are occasionally wrong and I enjoy noticing when that happens." "It doesn't happen often," she said. "No," he agreed with a smile. "It doesn't." They bought the Marsh parcel at $1,550, which was below Marsh's original asking price and above the Lockhart Yates threshold. And the negotiation was conducted by Letitia at a meeting with Marsh and his son at the county land office, which James attended mostly to watch her work and found every bit as satisfying as she probably intended. The summer of 1887 brought drought, as Kansas summers periodically did, and the drought brought strain of the kind that tested every farm and ranch in the region. The Double L survived it better than many because James had diversified the water supply years earlier. 3 wells, 2 catch ponds, and a channel from the creek that could be redirected. But it was a long, grinding, hot summer that demanded constant work and constant vigilance. It was during the drought that young Eli Jr., who was now 14, came to James one morning and asked, with the deliberate seriousness of a boy approaching a conversation he had been constructing for weeks, whether he could learn to manage the irrigation system. James had said yes. He had said yes simply, and without the patronizing modification that would have stung the boy's pride. And he had spent 3 days teaching Eli Jr. everything he knew about the channel system and the well levels and the calculations involved. Letitia watched this from the periphery of several of those sessions and said nothing, and felt something move in her chest that was not grief for Eli Sr., though it touched the memory of him, but was gratitude for the man standing in the dry field teaching her son to be a steward of the land. One evening during those drought weeks when the boys were in bed and the heat had eased slightly with the late evening, she and James sat on the porch as they often did, and she said, "Thank you for Eli. He wanted to learn," James said. "That does half the teaching for you. It's not only the irrigation," she said, "it's everything. The way you have been with him from the beginning, being careful with him, not pushing, just being present and letting him decide." "He's a good boy," James said. "He's going to be an exceptional man." She looked at him in the evening dark. "He is. I think he knows you see that." "I hope he does," James said. She reached over and took his hand, their 2 working hands, still roughened and capable, still the most honest portrait of who they both were, and he turned his hand to hold hers properly, and they sat with the Kansas evening around them and the drought's dry heat still in the air and the mockingbird in the cottonwood doing its earnest inventory of other birds. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Are you asking because you're unsure?" he said. "I'm asking because I want to hear you say it," she said. "Yes," he said. "Completely, are you?" She considered it with the seriousness she brought to all genuine questions. "I am," she said, "more than I expected to be, which is the best kind." The drought broke in September, and the Double L came through it sound. And that fall's cattle count was better than James had projected, and Letitia's accounts showed a surplus that she applied with characteristic efficiency to the next year's seed stock and a new timber frame for the north outbuilding. In 1888, Letitia discovered she was expecting again. She was 39 years old, and she received this information with the equanimity she brought to most challenges, and told James over breakfast on a Wednesday morning. He set down his coffee cup again. He had not, in the years between Robert's birth and now, lost the capacity to be thoroughly undone by certain categories of information from his wife. "Are you well?" he asked, which was his first question every time, and she loved him for it because it was always genuinely the first question. "Perfectly well," she said, "and happy about it." She considered him across the breakfast table. This man she had been married to for 5 years. This man she had watched build a relationship with her sons, and hold her youngest child and argue with her about land prices, and stand up from a chair in a bank without being asked. She considered him with all the knowledge of him she had accumulated over those years, which was considerable and was still, she thought, incomplete, because he continued to show her things she had not known were there to be shown. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Letitia," he said, and his voice held everything he meant. "Don't cry," she said. "I am not going to cry," he said, for the second time in their life together on this subject, and was slightly more successful than the first. Their daughter arrived in April of 1889, the first day of real spring, born with red-brown hair that was going to be spectacular, and a set of vocal opinions that she demonstrated immediately and consistently. They named her Clara Me Lockhart, and the Clara was for no one in particular. It was simply a name they both liked, arrived at through the same negotiation process they applied to all decisions of significance. The Me was for Letitia's mother, who had died when Letitia was 18, and who she had been missing in the particular renewed way that happens when a woman becomes a mother herself. Robert, who was 3.5 and had assumed he was the baby of the family in a permanent and constitutional sense, regarded his new sister with a wariness that transitioned over approximately 2 weeks into a possessive protectiveness that would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. He was, in this, more like his mother than his father, which James found privately hilarious. Samuel, who was 12 in 1889 and had fully entered the phase of life in which opinions are held loudly, declared Clara the best thing that had happened on the ranch since the new horse, which was meant as high praise and received as such by his mother, who knew her middle son. Young Eli Jr. was 16, and he held his baby sister with a careful, reverent gravity and said almost nothing, which was how he expressed the things that mattered most to him. He looked up at James over the baby's head with eyes that were his father's eyes. Letitia could still see Eli Sr. so clearly in that face, and said, "She looks like Mama," and James said, "Yes, she does, and she'll be all the better for it." And something passed between the two of them in that moment that was the final closing of a door neither of them had been sure would close. The year 1889 was also the year of the Oklahoma Land Run, which swept through the region's consciousness like a particular wind. The sense of expansion, of new territory, of everything being in motion. James watched it with interest and some concern, thinking about the patterns of settlement and displacement that he had seen in Kansas and that were now moving south. And he and Letitia talked about it over several evenings, with the same careful, unflinching attention they brought to the injustices they could see clearly. "The government will promise land to settlers," Letitia said, "and the people who were already there will find the promises made to them were worth less than the paper they were written on, the same as it was here." "The same as it was everywhere," James said. "I don't know how you build something good on top of that. I don't know that we have answered that question. I only know we have to keep asking it." "Yes," she said, "and keep teaching the children to ask it." Young Eli Jr., who was sitting at the far end of the table ostensibly reading but clearly listening, said, "Is that what you were doing when you told me about the Osage history of this land, making me ask the question?" "Yes," Letitia said. "Good," he said, and went back to his book, and both his parents looked at each other across the table with the particular look of parents who have done something right. The Double L Ranch continued to thrive into the early 1890s. The cattle business was good in those years, the wheat prices had stabilized, and the combination of the ranch and the Yates farm property, now managed primarily by Eli Jr., who had an extraordinary instinct for the land, was producing well. Eli Jr., at 20, was tall and spare like his father had been, with his mother's direct eyes and a quality of quiet, certain competence that made older men step back and give him room. He had been running the farm on the profit-sharing arrangement since he was 18, and in the spring of 1893 James transferred half the agreement into Eli Jr.'s name directly, with Letitia's full agreement, as the young man's rightful inheritance from his father's legacy given form and viability by the years of work everyone had put into it. Eli Jr. received this at the kitchen table where so many things had been received and discussed and decided over the years, and he looked at the papers for a long moment and then looked at his mother and then at James. "I don't have the words," he said. "You don't need them," James said. "Your father worked that land for 8 years. You've been working it for 6. It's yours." Eli Jr. nodded, and there was a brightness in his eyes that he controlled with the dignity of a young man, and then he shook James's hand with a grip that was firm and lasting. Samuel, by 1893, had decided that ranching was his destiny and was working as a full hand on the Double L with the infectious energy and moderate recklessness that characterized everything he did. He was 17 and already the kind of worker that foremen noticed and kept track of, and Tom Haverfield, who was getting older but had not retired his opinions, told James privately that Samuel had the best natural feel for cattle work he had seen in 20 years. Robert was 8, and clever in the particular way that promised excellent trouble throughout his school years, and he had recently announced that he wanted to be a lawyer, which Letitia received with an expression that James interpreted correctly as pride masquerading as reservation. Clara was 4, and in full possession of everyone's heart and fully aware of this fact, which she deployed with the sophisticated tactical genius of a youngest child raised among boys. It was on a September evening in 1893, with the harvest done and the weather turning and the 4 children at various stages of their evening routines, that James and Letitia sat on the porch of the Double L Ranch house in the cooling air of a Kansas autumn, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the silence that was, after 10 years, as comfortable and full as any conversation. The stars were brilliant and extravagant overhead. In the east, the lights of Caldwell were a faint suggestion on the horizon. The ranch was quiet in the specific satisfied way of a place that has been worked well and has rested. "I keep thinking about that morning in the bank," she said. He was quiet, listening. "I was terrified," she said. "I had been awake for 3 nights preparing those papers, going over every calculation. I had convinced myself I was right and that it would be simple if I was just organized enough. And then I walked in and I saw Prute's face and I knew it wasn't going to be simple." "But you walked up to the counter anyway," he said. "What else was I going to do?" she said. "Go home." He held her a little closer. "No, you were never going to do that." "And then you stood up," she said. "You just stood up. You didn't say anything, you didn't introduce yourself, you didn't ask permission. You just stood up and came and stood there behind me." "I know," he said. "I didn't know what to do with you," she said. "I thought you were trouble at first, another man deciding my business was his business. And then I heard you standing there," she said. "The quality of it, it wasn't the kind of standing where someone is planning to take over. It was the kind of standing where someone is making sure you can breathe." She paused. "I didn't know there was a difference until I felt it." He turned and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she felt it in the way she felt everything from him fully, with the particular attention of a woman who had lived without it and knew its value in a way that those who have always had it often cannot. "I stood up because it was right," he said. "I stayed because of you." "I know," she said. "I've known for a long time." The mockingbird in the cottonwood by the barn started up its evening performance, cycling through its borrowed catalog of calls, and the sound of it moved across the ranch yard and into the quiet and was absorbed by it. And they stayed on the porch as the stars deepened, and the night settled in with its full Kansas authority. In the house behind them, Robert could be heard conducting an argument with his sister over whose toy was whose, and Clara's voice rose in the decisive, non-negotiable register of a 4-year-old who has determined that justice must be served, and Letitia smiled against James's shoulder. "I should go in," she said. "Give it a minute," he said. "Eli Jr.'s in there. He'll sort it." She listened, and indeed, within 30 seconds Eli Jr.'s calm, authoritative voice was audible and the argument subsided and she relaxed. "That boy," she said quietly, meaning it in the way that all the best things about him were contained in just those 2 words. "Man," James said, "he's 20 years old. He will always be that boy to me," she said. "The one who held my hand into the church at our wedding with that terrible serious face, completely sure it was his job to get me there properly." "He did get you there properly," James said. "He did," she agreed. "You both did." The night was very still around them. In the distance a coyote called once, a long curling sound, and was answered by silence. "Are you cold?" James asked. "A little," she said. He stood and held his hand down to her, and she took it, those two hands, the same hands, cracked and worked and honest and known to each other now in every season and every circumstance. And she rose, and they went inside to their family and their warm kitchen and the specific, irreplaceable life they had built together from what they each had and what they each were. Inside, Clara had fallen asleep on the rug by the fireplace with a wooden horse clutched to her chest. Robert was at the table absorbed in a book. Eli Jr. was mending harness in the good light by the lamp. Samuel was not home yet. He was at the Haverfield family's place for supper and would be back by 9, which was the arrangement. James picked Clara up without waking her, with the practiced, easy certainty of a father who had been picking children up for years, and carried her toward the back room, and Letitia followed, and they tucked her in together as they had tucked children in together for all the years of their marriage, and stood over her for a moment in the way of parents standing over sleeping children, which is one of the oldest forms of prayer there is. Clara shifted, and one hand opened, and the toy horse rolled onto the pillow, and she was still again. James and Letitia stood there in the doorway and looked at their daughter, and at each other, and at the room around them, which contained a life that had been built not from luck alone, but from intention and honesty and the willingness, in the spring of 1883, for a man to stand up from a chair in a bank without a word, and for a woman to notice the quality of the standing. She took his hand in the doorway, as she had done so many times, and he closed his fingers around hers, as he always did, and they stood there together in the particular warmth of a home that was full of people they loved, in the good dark of a Kansas night, in the last years of a century that had been hard and honest in theirs. And if there was anything more that a life could offer, neither of them could think what it was. The Double L Ranch would stand for another 100 years after that evening, its fences sound and its land well tended, its history recorded in the growth rings of the cottonwood trees and the deep ruts of the roads that connected it to the wider world, and in the careful handwritten ledgers that Letitia kept and that her children kept after her, and in the deed of the Yates farm, which remained in Eli Jr.'s name, and then his son's name, and then his daughter's name. A piece of good Kansas ground that had been fought for on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883 by a woman with cracked hands and a straight back, and held ever after by the people who were the truest monument to what she had refused to surrender. They went back to the kitchen, the two of them, where Robert was still reading and Eli Jr. was still working on the harness, and Letitia put the kettle on for the last cup of the evening, and James sat at the table and picked up the newspaper that had arrived 2 days ago from Wichita, and the kitchen was warm and light, and full of the ordinary particular sounds of a family at the end of a day, and outside the Kansas night went on in its vast and indifferent splendor. And everything was exactly as it should be.